Scott, I want you to talk a little bit at some point about the role of private corporations in providing national and international security, and whether or not you have a role to play in global governance. But I should have mentioned at the beginning that Scott served for a long time in the Justice Department on cyber crime. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between cyber crime and cyber terrorism and what needs to be done both by private corporations, by national governments, and perhaps some international body you can help us identify that would have a role?
So the Internet is very challenging from a governance model, and governments all around the world are now devising cybersecurity strategies. And the reason it's so challenging for governments is normally when government undertakes issues of this level of an import, they often have more control over the assets in question. There's an interesting, comparison here. If you think back to the Cold War and nuclear weapons, governments designed, maintained, and kept their fingers on the triggers of nuclear weapons. And so from that context, they had both responsibility for national security and control of the critical asset. The interesting thing about the Internet, of course, is that it was designed, deployed, and is still maintained roughly 85 to 90% by the private sector. And so as the cybercrime problem has grown, and as governments have gotten more concerned about terrorism and cyber warfare, governments have essentially said, look, we have this responsibility, our traditional responsibility to protect public safety and national security, but we don't control the asset. The asset's designed, maintained, deployed by the private sector. And because of that, most of the governments in the world have really focused on what they call establishing public-private partnership. Basically, partnership between government and industry to protect the Internet. And in the early years of this partnership, to be blunt, we were focusing on the wrong thing. Government and industry focused heavily on information sharing. The theory was industry had a lot of information about its systems, vulnerabilities, and threats. The government has a lot of information about adversaries, and that if we all just shared this information, things would be better. And it didn't work. People didn't share the information. Governments don't share information because sometimes they're protecting sources of methods and they think the information's too sensitive to share. Industry doesn't share information because, to be blunt, running around talking about vulnerabilities in your products is not a good way to engender confidence in the market and enhance your reputation. And, and then there was the question of, even if we share this information, what are we actually going to do with it? And so over time, I have come to rethink the public-private partnership, and I have another model which I've been encouraging governments to adopt, and this is the way I think about it now. Markets do provide some level of security. We actually provide a level of security that customers demand and pay for. That's called market force. And we also do a little bit more because we have a sense of public responsibility and corporate citizenship. That said, markets do not provide security at national security and public safety levels. You cannot make a market case for the Cold War. And therefore, when you need something at that level, it's usually achieved through some other mechanism, like government action. Knowing that to be true, what I've been saying to governments is the way to think about the public-private partnership is as follows. See what security the market will give you, that the vendors will give you. Figure out what you need in terms of national security and public safety, and let's figure out together how to bridge the gap. And the government, in that sense, has a lot of tools in its arsenal. It's part of standard-setting bodies, so it can set standards. In most governments in the world, in most countries in the world, the government is the single largest purchaser of IT. So if they make it a requirement for purchasing, that's driving the market. And then governments can regulate. They can if they need to. And so the real key is to figure out how to establish that governance model. The other thing about governance model, which is important, is the Internet has thrived in part because it has no governance model. No one is in charge of the internet. You have an internet engineering task force that works on standards. You have ICANN, which manages the domain name system. But it has always been, once the U.S. government took it out of the military domain and decided it should be a public resource, the internet has always been run through collaborative process. And the challenge for governments is when they have problems, they usually think in terms of command and control structures, and there's no command and control structure for the internet.
How would you characterize government response, say the U.S. government, European governments, to what you're describing?
I think they have gotten better. They have worked to develop consistent and harmonized cybersecurity strategies, and they are working on international strategies as well. Having said that, they are faced with a couple of huge challenges. One is it's really hard to do attribution on the internet. I can't highlight how important this is. If you think, let me use the U.S. as an example since I spent time in the Justice Department. We have, and most governments are the same way, there are different threats that governments worry about. They worry about crime, they worry about intelligence gathering, they worry about warfare. And for each of those elements, they have different agencies that work the problem. They have law enforcement agencies, they have intelligence agencies, and they have military agencies. What authorities those agencies can use are different. They have criminal authorities to do wiretaps and gather evidence, they have espionage authorities, and they have military authorities. Which agency you use and what authority you rely on depends on two things: who's attacking and why. If it's a criminal, you use a law enforcement agency with law enforcement authority. If you think someone's collecting intelligence from your military system, use your intelligence agencies with intelligence authority. If someone's dropping kinetic bombs on you, use your military and your military authority. It all depends on who's attacking and why. What are the two things you don't know in an internet attack? Who's attacking and why? So they're stuck.
Is there a military response, a feasible military response to an attack that would take down the national power grid, would take down the markets, the financial structure of a country? Let's take the United States again as an example. What could the United States do militarily in that scenario?
So you have to, I think, look at the two buckets of military action. There's arguably cyber action you can take. Some of it is defensive, like dropping packets. Some of it can be offensive, shooting packets back. But you can also take kinetic action, right?
Right.
And one of the interesting problems, though, in the internet space is the problem of targeting. Let's suppose you have a nuclear facility and there's a denial of service launched against your power grid. And so packets are coming from all over the world, and you decide you're going to shoot back with packets. Well, the way the criminals work today, they take over thousands of consumer machines. They're called botnets. They take over thousands of computer machines of consumers, and they point them at the target, and then they shoot at the target. If you shoot back, you will take out a lot of consumer machines, but you won't take out the person who's attacking you, who will reconstitute a new botnet and go again. So, because it's hard to do attribution, it's hard to know who to shoot at, right? The other thing I should say is you see more and more language about cyber warfare, but I'm increasingly reading things where people are challenging the sheer notion of cyber warfare. And what I mean by that is this: if you look at the history of warfare, when countries engage in war, if it's not to defend themselves, it's to get territory, resources, or get some political advantage. It is very unlikely, at least today, that simply by sending packets across the internet, you will topple a regime, extract mineral resources, or anything like that. So there's a growing body of thought that cyber attack in the cyber warfare context is more likely to be done in conjunction with kinetic activity than just standing alone.
Right.